Hi, my name is Fletcher Fox. Uh, I'm gonna go start with my story and how I overcame years of tragic abuse. When I was in sixth grade, my father and mother received joint custody of me by the courts. I think my father and other people lied about my mother to help him get half custody of me. So anyway, when I started living there, my father and his partner were very strict, and it was very hard on me. And they would give me inane punishments and timeouts. And my father hit me several times. Like he punched me on the head once, and he punched me on another part of my body once, and he kept hitting, kicking, and slapping me an entire weekend. Another time. And then I deteriorated in school because of my living situation from abuse and maternal deprivation from not being with my mother as much. So my father, I was getting the police to go after him for child abuse, and he was scared of getting arrested, so he sent me to Logan River Academy in Utah, where he could silence me. When I was at Logan River Academy, I struggled with making it to a higher level, to level 4, which enabled me to have more contact with my family because of my lack of social skills and eye contact at the time from my possible autism diagnosis. Then after I made level 4, I did eventually. There was also isolation rooms where I would see other students, where students would have to sit in a room for a really long time and not move as a consequence for bad behavior or suicide attempts or homicide attempts. And if you ran away, you could be there for an entire month, varying on what the consequences were for. I used to see other students get restrained constantly, and like staff would come push a student to the ground. It was very scary. And then after they helped my father get joint custody, they helped my father get sole custody over me at the end when when they saw that my mother was almost taking me out. They testified against her along with my father in court. My father was only temporarily supposed to have sole custody over me, but he ended up having permanent sole custody over me until my 18th birthday, for almost 3 years after that. One time, my mother and my maternal grandmother came to Logan, Utah to try to visit me, and my therapist told him that they were forbidden to visit me anymore, and he called the police to have them escorted off of the school's campus before they could do anything, and they tricked me into thinking that my mother and grandmother were coming and weren't coming anymore when they told me they weren't, and I thought it was just a misrumor when it wasn't, that they were coming at all in the first place. So a month after that, a lawyer called them right after that, and that it was against their school. When they found out I was associated to this lawyer, they didn't want me there anymore. So my father sent me to another residential boarding school very similar to Logan River Academy in Massachusetts called Frederick L. Chamberlain International School. When I got to Frederick L. Chamberlain International School, I found out that I was only allowed to have a visit with my parents rotating every other month, and I was only allowed to have one phone call a week with each of my parents to start with, mainly my mother, because my father made that rule to punish my mother, and the school were abiding by it. When I was on a visit with my mother in July 2014, I kept getting hysterical about not being allowed to have limited contact with my mother. And there was a time when I tried to run away from the visit to escape and not have to go back there, and I pulled a knife to near my arm once, and I didn't kill myself, but I thought about it, and I called the police, and the police came over that night and recommended for my mother to sleep with me, and for my mother to take me to the Horsham Clinic. When my mother tried to take me to the Horsham Clinic, my father, or the school, I think, threatened to take all my mother's contact away from me if she did that even while I was a suicide risk. And they opposed that my mother would sleep in bed with me in the first place. So I came back to Chamberlain, and about a month, almost 2 months later, my father took me to Nantucket with him and his family. And during that trip, they wouldn't let me talk to my mother at all during that trip because they blamed her for something that had happened before, which wasn't her fault. And when I was in Nantucket, I was crying. I decided to run to a sheriff's office and try to escape again. And they decided to call my father back. And my father walked by there, and they sent me back with him, which I don't necessarily think was right, but they did anyway. So I went back. So at the end of September 2014, about 4 weeks after running to the sheriff's office, my mother came to my school to pick me up for a visit for 2 days, and then the next day she decided to bring me back to her cousin's house and talk to her cousin's friend, who was a retired social worker, and they took me to the police, and the police took me to the UMass Medical Center to try to get me out of the school at the time and get me to a place that was closer to home to help me, just so I wouldn't have to go back there, even though I didn't need a residential boarding school at all in the first place. And I was there with my mother, and I was happy to be with her. And then I stayed up with my mother and her cousin in the emergency room until about 4 a.m. And then I woke up about 3 hours later, and I could see the school's clinical director, Larry Muddy, from a far distance. And I asked him if my mother was still there, and he told me that she wasn't. And I spent the rest of the day there with staff from the school until my father came to pick me up that night. And I think my father's partner signed me out of there. It was one of the worst days of my life, knowing that my mother was gone in the emergency room. And it was because of my father's order, and he had the power to do that when he had sole custody over me. Another thing I found out when I was at Chamberlain was that I wasn't allowed to talk about my parental problems with anyone there besides my therapist, and staff would refuse to talk to me about it, or they would silence me if they caught me talking to someone else about my parental problems, or threaten to take the phone away from me if I didn't stop talking to my family members about my parental problems at times. So I met with the judge in January 2015 and told him about my living situation, and it transcripted, and the judge decided to ignore my testimony by calling me autistic, by using my autism diagnosis as a possible reason not to listen to it. And the school decided to take all my mother's contact away from me that same month, a few weeks after I met with the judge, and that lasted for a year and a half, where I wasn't allowed to have any visits or phone calls, she wasn't allowed to write me any letters, and I was only allowed to write letters to my mother. They would only send my letters to my mother if they were very plain or bland. And it continued with me not being allowed to talk about my parents. However, when they took all my mother's contact away from me, they let me call her family members instead all the time, along with my father and his family members. But they would take my family members off the calling list if I made any suicide attempts, which I'll go into a little bit. So in July 2015, my grandmother secretly let me call my mother on a visit, and she told me that these interviewers were coming. And then a few weeks later, I found out my father purposely took me out of school while the interviewers were there, and I had a freak out, and I ended up in the hospital because I talked about suicide that day. And then I went back, and then they took away all my contact with my mother's family for a while. And then, what was it? And it just continued. And then in January 2016, I had another suicide attempt because I was so sad about everything. I'd known 2 other students that had jumped out of a window and never had to go back there. So I talked about doing the same thing in front of my therapist and the school psychiatrist. And they put me on super close watch for a day when I did that. And then I started seeing an outside licensed mental health counselor in July 2016. In April 2016 I was talking to my maternal uncle on his birthday, and I asked him about my mother, and I got 3 prompts to stop it because I wasn't supposed to talk about my mother at all, or mention her, and after 3 prompts, the staff gathered close to me and forced me to end the phone call for breaking the rules, which was completely absurd. Then, around the summer of 2016, there was 3 different times where I admitted to writing my mother while I was there and away at a summer program at a college, and they took away my computer tablet or my laptop, whatever I had, for a few days or maybe even, for like 1 or 2 days to make sure I wouldn't write to my mother in a way I wasn't supposed to, like emailing her. And then the last major incident I dealt with there was in October 2016. I was in Bermuda, and the staff there called me a 5-year-old and an uneducated 17-year-old when I got upset about not being able to go upstairs. And then in November 2016, on Thanksgiving Day, 1 day before my 18th birthday, I moved in with my mother and have lived happily with her since. I thank you all for watching this video.